to talk about introducing TBRI and Student Athlete Services today. So we'll start with a video and then talk a little bit about our agenda and what we're going to go over today and introduce ourselves.
This is not an angry Black poem, though I'm angry Black. This is more of a cry for all the Black men who were never given permission to cry. For all the Black boys tried as men who were taught not to feel by people who did not love them, taught not to feel by people who did. I know that I'm a Black man. I've seen the reflection of my skin in the eyes of too many stares in my lifetime to forget. The first time I was taught how not to feel, I was 9 years young, my lungs still learning to breathe in America. That day, I witnessed the police talk down to my uncle like he wasn't a skyline, like I didn't look up to him, like he wasn't a king in bag jeans with a smile that echoed the sound of war ending and peace rising from the air. I can recall my heart balling into a clenched fist, bare-knuckled aim towards his reckless mouth, calling my uncle every name but the one my grandmother gave him. When the cop handed him back his driver's license, along with his dignity, the car ride home was a silent one. Tension filled our vehicle like thick fog. My uncle threw his smile in the back seat and his boy traveled somewhere distant. His face became an abandoned church Sunday, and I was an awkward prayer sitting in the front seat, not knowing what to do with my body, so I mimicked his mad. I figured if we had the same ground in our face, he would remember that I was his kin. Later that evening, he sits me down and talks to me about what to do when I'm stopped by the police. His voice, serious as a siren howling through the projects. It was then when I realized that this is not the first time his smile was arrested for no reason. But what was sad is that he did not talk to me about how he felt, about where he hid his anger when we got home, about the pain still a river rising in his eyes from the first time the police beat him because his skin blended too well with midnight past. He just carried on his day. Like being harassed by the police was normal because in his world it was. In his world, no one ever gave him permission to feel. In his world, he was treated numb and then was accused of being numb. 3 years later, on one tragic night in Chicago, my uncle lost his smile for good when a bullet missed a crowd and landed in his skull. I remember his funeral like it was this morning. He laid still as a night star in the casket. I pressed my curious fingers against his lifeless body. He was cold, hard, numb, void of emotion, just like his environment taught him to be when he was alive. Groups of women in my family took turns screaming in unison like a choir of grieving mothers. But all the men in my family sat in the pews, still as stone, trying not to crumble, pretending not to be broken. They were also lifeless. The only difference between their faces and my dead uncle was the occasional tears escaping their eyes like runaway slaves down the field of their cheeks. There is no scene sadder than hurting men, afraid to be hurting men in public. The second time I was taught how not to feel, it was during his repast. My heart was still confetti, still learning the beats of the rhythm of my uncle being gone. My older cousin, who experienced too many deaths in his young life, said, "Boy, why are you still crying? Don't you know it's time for you to be strong for your family? Your mother doesn't need a weak man in the house at this time." My tear ducts dried up and became a deserted land. And in all my years, the men in my life have taught me that my emotions is a disease, because where I'm from, showing the wrong emotions might get you killed, or worse, live in the shame of being human. For so long, I thought my emotions were weakness. It took 2 years into my marriage for my wife to see me cry once, and when she did, I thought I failed her. I thought she doesn't need a weak man in the house at this time. She doesn't need a husband. The first time I was taught how to feel.
Okay, so today we're just going to talk about this poem. I think does a really good job of framing this idea for us. A lot of our students have access to a lot of resources. They have family that provided for them, and still provide a lot of what they need, but not all of them did. And so today we want to talk about trauma, defining that. And like I said, this poem helps frame that idea, put words into some of the challenges and experiences of trauma. So we're going to introduce the concept of TBRI. This is a concept that I learned in foster parent training, actually, and how we can incorporate that into our work in student athlete services. So why us? My name is Molly Ty. I'm a scholastic supervisor here at Texas A&M. I work with the defense on the football team, and I've been in student athlete services for over 10 years now, which is crazy to think about, actually. And I also am a foster parent to these little babies here over the years, and they've been integrated into my life in athletics and gotten to be around and so many of you all, and just be a part of this world. And so when I was in a foster parent training talking about the idea of TBRI, I just couldn't wait I knew immediately that Jess would relate to me in this, like how this works in what we do every day. And so that started a journey a couple years ago of us just learning more about this and how it could integrate. I'm a social worker by education as well, and this has really just helped frame my philosophy for the work that I do here. And for me, if there's a new mindset, a new idea that could help one more student be successful, that could help us reach one more student to help them have a better future than they had before they arrived with us, then that's worth it for me.
Yeah. And I'm Jess Busto. I'm a learning specialist here at Texas A&M. And I've also been in the field for about 7 years now. And so I've been able to share in the foster experience a little bit with Molly's kiddos and getting to experience that relationship and those bonds. And then when Molly came to me with the TBRI theory and framework, I was really excited about it because it gave a language, it gave a framework to explain what we do as learning specialists and working in this field. Often what we do is viewed as babying when we're meeting students where they're at developmentally, emotionally. And so this TBRI gave kind of a framework and a language to explain why I was doing what I was doing. And that is very important for advocacy. Just even having conversations with my coworkers, with peers, with administration. I've been at multiple different schools. I'm at a Power 5 now, but I was at a much smaller schools before this. And so having this language and this framework really helps us have those conversations and have those conversations effectively when talking about our student athletes. So we're going to first start by talking about defining trauma. So trauma, the first official definition listed in the dictionary is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. And this I wanted to bring up because I think it's a great way, and it's how we're going to frame trauma as we talk throughout this presentation. Trauma isn't just something that happened externally, right? It's not physical. It's a distressing or disturbing experience or event. Molly's going to get into and talk about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And these are going to be all different, ranging from immediate micro level to the macro level experiences. And as she does that, it's important to know that trauma isn't always a major bad event, right? It may be a combination of some smaller events or just the fact that they happen very closely in a time frame period that can have an effect on an individual. And often in our society, trauma is often normalized. It is, oh, somebody else is going through it worse. Everyone has their own struggles. Everyone has their own story, right? It's normalized. It's kind of for a lot of individuals. And the important thing to note is that the body's response to trauma is biological. It doesn't have to be a physical response. There's going to be a biological change to that individual who's experienced any form of trauma. And that is missed brain connections, ways to develop relationships. That is going to affect them at the brain level.
Did you finish it? Oh my goodness, buddy.
It's important to know that trauma is an outward external thing that happens, right? But there can be the absence of something, and that is neglect. Children from a young age, they learn that their voice starts when they're babies, when they're infants, when they cry. That is them expressing a need. And when those hands don't come, when nobody comes to meet that need, they learn to distrust. They learn that they're not valued, their voice is not heard, and their voice starts to become quiet. And so they learn, and these are the biological brain connections, that their voice is not important. And this shows up in their behaviors. And that's how they learn how to get what they need out of life. And so these things can affect any student, right? This affects anyone in this country, but unfortunately, disproportionately Black student athletes due to the systemic racism that exists in our nation. And in Emmett Gill's presentation on Black males' trauma, he says up to 74% of Black males will experience 3 or more ACEs in their childhood. And so it's important to note, right, I mentioned earlier, what may be traumatic to one might not be traumatic to someone else. Some students Molly mentioned, they have a lot of support, they have resources, and they're able to work through and cope and move on, and those experiences don't affect them as it would another student. It's important to note that the trauma and what's going on, the neglect, it's what happened to you, it's not who you are. It's an external event, and it's not internalized, it's not who they are. The problem is when things start to become internalized, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And trauma could be something that is witnessed. It doesn't have to be something that happened to you, but witnessing or close relative, those things can affect especially a child profoundly. And like I talked about, this language, kids from hard places is a term. It's used often in foster care and in TBRI, but it provides us a language to talk about these students who are from different places, different areas that may have experienced and had some harmful things in their environment.
Okay, so what are ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences? In Dr. Gill's presentation a few years ago, he talked about trauma with Black student athletes and was really helpful in framing for us how we would describe these ACEs. So a lot of these here are from his presentation. There's the obvious ones per se, like abuse and neglect, alcoholism and incarceration. But a couple that I want to really draw attention to is the micro level ACEs of feelings that are constantly invalidated. A student whose parents who may have expressed needs, who may have had tried to share that they were struggling with something and were told that, you know, that's, you're just being dramatic, oh, they're just emotional all their lives, that can be an ACE. That can be something that impacts their ability to communicate that to us now. Or feeling unseen and competing for attention. Often our children from higher economic statuses may have families who have traveled, or they've lived with a nanny their whole lives, and those things may not be, and usually aren't, an ACE for a student. They're usually not an experience that would be traumatic, but for some that it is. Jess and I have a student who we worked with mutually who I think for sure this was the case for him. And then in the meso level, there's things like internalized racism, microaggressions. The research on how many microaggressions our student athletes, especially our Black male student athletes, experience on campus is incredible to think about that many. Being the parent to siblings or your parents, this is something that often children in poverty may have experienced and can pile on that additional ACE to the trauma of poverty as well. And then in the macro level, things, and you'll notice things included there like epidemics and pandemics and natural disasters. A lot of our students here at Texas A&M experienced Hurricane Katrina as a child. That can often be counted as an ACE. That was a traumatic experience for them. And then obviously all of us are living in a pandemic right now. And so you can see how quickly these can add up. Once again, like we've talked about, not all of these things would occur as a traumatic experience for everyone, but there's the possibility that it does. What's traumatic to one person may not be to another, or they may have been able to get the support and the resources they need to work through this before they arrive on our campus.
So then this trauma has occurred, and how does it present itself for these students, for these children? So the first way it presents itself is this independence, right? This survival, I am my own person. I don't trust anyone. This, I can do it, I got it. They learned from a young age that they can't trust people. If they say something, they may not get what they need back. So they learn that if they want something done, they have to take care of it on their own. This goes into negative self-concept. When that trauma, that external event happens, and they take it and internalize it and believe that it had something to do with them or it is a reflection of them, they can feel very poorly about themselves, low self-confidence, low self-esteem, just a low self-image, and also feel like they don't deserve what their life is. You know, my friends didn't make it out. My friends are in jail. I don't deserve to be here, and they can't enjoy the experience they're having here at the college level. Affect dysregulation, and that's displaying inappropriate emotional response, especially in response to a negative stimuli, right? So they're panicking, they're having a very dramatic, sometimes aggressive reaction, but it's their body's way of kind of being in that fight or flight syndrome. And then the opposite of that is the negative emotion, right? The fact that the emotion isn't there. And Dr. Emmett Gill refers to this as the cool posse syndrome, where you don't want to show your emotion, you don't want to show that vulnerability, everything's cool, you don't want to, especially in front of your friends, right? That's where the cool posse comes from. In front of other people, you don't want to expose yourself and show maybe how you are feeling. And so everything's cool. There's just no real, very vague responses. This also represents itself in hypervigilance, this being constantly over aware of what's in the surroundings, whether it's other people, whether it's the environment that they're in, how is it set up, what does that look like, always looking over their shoulders, always looking at doorways, entrances, exits, those types of things, and just being really aware of what their environment around them looks like. And this presents itself non-verbally. Students are not going to say that they experienced some trauma or some events, and that's why they're reacting this way. That's for us to recognize some of these nonverbal cues and behaviors that the students are presenting, as maybe there's a sign of some other things that are going on that are not just on this, just more deeper than the surface level. So when we're working with students in our offices, in our learning centers, in our labs, what are some of these behaviors and what do they look like? So anxious, students being very jittery, kind of shaky, really overly concerned about certain tests. Some students that you can't even present what's happening tomorrow or the day after that. You just have to focus one day at a time because it becomes too overwhelming. Vague responses. We all have students that are just, cool, it's cool, I'm cool to everything. Sometimes it is some aggressive behaviors, and that some of that can be a result of those anxious behaviors, right? It's maybe pushing themselves away from a computer, standing up in the middle of a, talking to a student, kind of slamming keyboards, and then lying, never really being honest, telling the truth about how exams went with their classes, class attendance, anything like that. It could even be subtle as not wanting to go home on breaks. It's the student that's maybe just kind of hanging around, doesn't really have somewhere to go when everyone else has gone and left and they just don't want to go home. And sometimes once you build that relationship, or some students will disclose and they will just tell you what's happened to them, because for them it's normal. This is their life. This is what they know. And they will just flat out tell you.
With a lot of these behaviors that Jess just talked about, we can see these in different ways. Not every student who's anxious or who lies to you may be doing that from a place of trauma. So I just wanted to clarify that a lot of these things can happen for different reasons, but that's part of why it's important for us to know our students, to get to know them, to be paying attention to if there's some of these other things that are presenting that may be the reason for this, and not just categorizing them as, oh yeah, they're lazy, or they lie, or he overreacts to everything. She's just, never can tell the truth, that kind of thing. Finding out, getting to know them better, to know what is the underlying reason for why we're seeing these behaviors. So now we're going to get into what is TBRI, or trust-based relational intervention. The good news is that the brain can heal at any stage in our lives. I just think that is such a cool thing in the way we were created, that our brains can heal at any point. Obviously, we wish it was before they were 18 years old, right? Or that their brain had never been damaged by this trauma, but it can still happen as an 18 to 22-year-old. This video we're going to show in a second shows a small child in this scenario, but TBRI has the same strategies for teens as well. So TBRI is an attachment-based, trauma-informed intervention. It's designed to meet the complex needs of vulnerable children. It was developed by Karen Purvis, who out of TCU. And TBRI uses empowering principles to address their physical needs, connecting principles for attachment needs, and correcting principles to disarm fear-based behaviors. We'll talk about all of those here in a minute. And while this intervention is based on years of attachment, sensory processing, and neuroscience research, the heartbeat of TBRI really is connection. Because of their histories, children who've experienced trauma have changes in their bodies, like Jess talked about, their brains and behaviors and belief systems. While a variety of these strategies may be successful in typical circumstances, children with histories of harm may need caregiving that meets their unique needs and addresses the whole child. And isn't that what we're here to do, right? We work in academics, but hopefully we're willing and interested in developing the whole student athlete. So we found that any child benefits from this nurturing, trusting relationship with a safe adult, but especially these children from hard places. So we'll watch a video now that explains this concept.
TBRI, trust-based relational intervention, has at its core building a trusting relationship. It has 3 sets of principles, and they look at the child as a whole. When you think about development, the baby cries and I say, yes, I will comfort you. And so this child learns that they have a voice. They learn trust, which is the lesson of the first year of life. I can trust. There are so many children from hard places. And for those children, their capacity to trust has been fiercely damaged. The brain chemistry of a child who cries and no one comes is dramatically altered. The child with a history of trauma or loss or abuse has no hope of healing without a nurturing relationship. In every way that I make time and space, that I give touch, eye contact, and I give words, I am going to empower this child to go back to the beginning of what he or she should have experienced in the arms of a loving parent that said, when you cry, I will come. The phenomenal thing about a trust-based intervention, as we connect to this child, as we build safety, we actually change the brain chemistry. We change the wiring of the brain. It's this really the heart and soul of all that we are and all that we do. Do I look into the child's eyes? Do I touch their arm when I talk to them? When they talk to me, do I stop what I'm doing and talk to them? This is the essence of mindfulness. The excitatory chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. All regulation occurs first with an external regulator. So in the beginning, I regulate all. They're cold, I bring warmth. They're crying, I bring myself. And out of my regulation, their brain develops capacity for self-regulation. If this child didn't have this experience, that child doesn't feel safe. This chemistry can be altered, first by knowing they're safe, second by nutrient-rich foods, third by my environmental regulation of that child's emotion, and fourth by appropriate exercise. So we can balance brain chemistry by creating a holistic environment. We clearly have to deal with behavior. Correcting means showing a child the right behavior, praising him when he gets it, and showing it to him until he can get it right, and showing him with no fear and no shame so that he builds success, not a greater sense of failure. So the message of hope for our families is that we can help our children to dramatic levels of healing. We simply have to be devoted to it and be willing to invest what it's going to take.
Okay, so like Molly talked about when she introduced TBRI, and like the video talked about, there are 3 core principles of TBRI, and using these together is what makes this intervention so effective. And this is very similar, as you're looking at these and hearing some of these words, to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the baseline needs to be addressed. Baseline needs for an individual need to be addressed before anything else can move on, before learning can happen, before relationships are built, before self-actualization can happen. So this first baseline for TBRI is empowering, is meeting the physical needs of these students so that they are empowered and they feel like they have control of their environment and their situation. So this, in doing this, the environment needs to be safe. And so we think of our college campuses, our learning center spaces, right, as safe. But if the student doesn't feel that way, that it doesn't matter. We can say it's safe all we want, but if they don't feel safe in that space, there's something that kind of is off to them. There's people coming and going, whether it's other students, staff, the size of the space, the way it's laid out. If they don't feel safe there, they cannot move on to the next stages of TBRI, and able to connect and kind of build and take the most out of what's happening in those spaces. And this is called felt safety. And so this helps build self-regulation, right? So if they're in an environment where they feel safe, where they can be vulnerable, where they can let their guards down, they're able to self-regulate and learn to process emotions and process things that are happening in a different way. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book, Between the World and Me, as African-American journalist and author, he talks about how his brain, a third of his brain was devoted to making sure that he felt safe, that he was looking around, that whatever environment he was in, a third of his brain power was devoted to just making sure he was okay in that space. And that's brain power he says and feels that he wishes he could have used otherwise and been able to really take, build connections and take more out of what he was experiencing in his life. So the 2 ways that we can empower and build these connections and the safety for our students is the first, like the video mentioned, is physiological. Are they getting the food that they need? Are they staying hydrated? And obviously there's staff members, there's nutritionists, right, for some of these student athletes that monitor hydration levels and food, but for some students, maybe they're not drinking the water they should. Maybe they don't like the dorm food or the nutrition center food, and they're kind of going home and eating ramen and honey buns, and that's really what they're eating, and that physiological needs are not being met. And so they're worried about food and they're always hungry. And then the other one that we have a lot more control of is the ecological, that environment around them, how we are in our space, who we allow in our academic center, in and out of our rooms. And that matters. I have a student who, it took a while for him to feel comfortable in our space. Here at A&M, we have larger learning labs for the learning specialists. So there's usually 2 or 3 students in the rooms, and there's people that are coming in and out. And it took him a while to feel comfortable in that space. And after a few months, a coach came down, had a very negative interaction with him in full view of a lot of people. And it took a while for him to feel back to that felt safety, right? He kept saying, after this happened, why did he come at me like that in my space where I was doing my work? Why did he do that to me? And it really disrupted him. And I noticed for at least a few weeks after that, he would only sit at certain computers where he could see the door, where he could see different things. And so he had to really rebuild that feeling of safety of being in that space where he could learn. And so this manifests itself too, and do we have this open space in this room and how's it set up? Or does a student need to be in a small room where they're not distracted, right? As we talked about with hypervigilance, students always wanting to make sure they know who's in their environment, looking over their shoulder. If that's going to be distracting and they can't work and start to feel comfortable, maybe a small room is better for those types of students. And once again, this boils down to empowering. We want the students to feel comfortable and that they have ownership in these spaces. So transitions are really important. Are they going to be moving spaces? Are they changing classes? What does that look like for them? So the more that we can do to make those transitions, prepare them for that, that is going to be very important for empowering them, no matter what environment they walk into.
So once we have this felt safety, right? And sometimes we may get it in one setting and then and be able to move on, and then we have to come back and reestablish felt safety again. Can't overemphasize how important this is, and how much I've seen that be effective, whether it's with the little kiddos that come in and out of my life sometimes, or with the big kiddos, as we say. But once we have that felt safety, then that's the time to build these connecting principles, to teach attachment, to be mindful of where our students have come from, what to expect with them, and how we can connect with them, what is going to be effective for them. And a lot of that comes from, okay, so what's their story? Where are they from? What do they expect about academics? Those kinds of things. But it also can be just day to day. What's happened today, before they arrived in Learning Center, before they came for their appointment with me? What happened today? Is it, we work with football, right? So winter workouts are just finishing up. Is it the first day of winter workouts and everyone's exhausted, and that's going to impact how today goes? Is it the day, did they just meet with their coach for their yearly evaluation, or is it the day that starters are named for the season? What are those things that happened outside of us before they arrived at this session? Did they get in a fight with their girlfriend? Or there's so many different scenarios that may have happened, and we don't necessarily always know what those are. But being aware that as we get to know our students, that something different may have happened. I just recently had a student who got pulled over by the police on his way to his session, and he arrived late. We could have easily, the response could have been, the second he walked in, like, why are you late? What's going on? What's happening? But immediately when he walked in and said, hey, can I talk to you in private? I knew, like, wait a minute, something went different. Something is not normal for this student athlete. And so being able to just adjust to that, to have, at that moment for that student and that experience that he had just had, academics was not going to be the most important thing. And so that's where what we bring to the interaction becomes really important too. Am I caring or sympathetic? Can I be flexible in how I address each student, and what my expectations or what the outcomes I wanted for the day to be, maybe not being that? Do I come across as a drill sergeant, or am I super tough and I have all these expectations? Even what the things that I bring that I can't control, being a male or a female, that may, depending on what they are used to academically, either way could be something that they weren't expecting, or that may take a little bit of time for them to adjust to. We also can't just assume that because we have something in common with them, that's going to bridge all these gaps for connecting and attachment. That, oh, well, they're a girl from the Midwest and I'm a girl from the Midwest, so we're going to be good. Everything will be fine. Our stories can be very, very different in that situation. We can bring an excitement about learning. I have a student athlete who used to meet with Jess and doesn't anymore. And he expressed to me recently that it's like, I just miss Jess's energy for learning. Like, I need that when I come in the building. And so those are awesome, that expectation for success that we can bring. And sometimes there's stereotypes that we have about where students are from, or who's going to be successful, that kind of thing. And that categorization can be very damaging for our students in this area if we're not aware of that. For correcting principles, then this is where we move, that once again, once we have the first two, then okay, how can we disarm these fear-based behaviors? This is effective because we've done the first two steps. Often we can jump to this, but it's only going to be effective if we've done the first two steps. That we are making sure that we're providing a model, that we're showing them how to practice these abilities, these different strategies, that as we prepare for transitions, that we're practicing little transitions, that, as Jess is a learning specialist and I as a scholastic supervisor, we have a lot of students in common. practicing how they communicate from one of us to the other, and then that's helping teach them a skill to communicate with professors. Like, yes, they can come say whatever they need to me, but if Jess can help them practice how to communicate effectively in their communication with me, that's a safe space to do that. Ultimately, we're educators, right? We're not authoritarians. We're not disciplinarians at the core, but also we're very aware that in the world of athletics, we're very outcome based. We're about discipline. We're about structure. And so balancing how to be educators in that space, this has really helped me frame some of that conversation and how we can teach and model those behaviors for students and help them build those skills. And really the combination of these things, right? That's the secret sauce. That's the answer. It's not just one of these. It's not using little bits and pieces of this, but the combination of them together.
Yeah, and it's important to note too that life isn't linear, right? We don't work in stages, and feelings and things happen, right? So sometimes, like I mentioned in my example, we were in a spot where the student felt safe in the space, but then we had to go back where he did not feel safe in that space. So some of these correcting behaviors and things that I would do with him to help him adjust and build those connections in his brain might not be the best time to do that when he's still trying to kind of recover and feel back and feel safe. And so we're constantly kind of going back and forth a little bit, but once you start laying those foundations, once they know they have felt safe in the space before, it becomes quicker and they're able to adjust and get back to those connections and those relationships. So laying this groundwork, letting them know that, providing the area for them to be safe and building those connections and building those relationships, it helps them move forward the next time something negative happens, and they're able to, and that's where the brain repair comes in. They're able to bounce back and adjust and self-regulate better.
So what is the effect that this has on our work? How do we play this out? So ultimately, it comes down to taking time to get to know our students. I know that we have lots of outcomes, expectations. All of us have different sizes of caseloads, different numbers of students or roster sizes that we're working with. But ultimately, it's important that we get to know our students, it's easy to categorize and make assumptions about them. That's human nature, actually. It's not even just it helps us feel and be more efficient in our work, but that can be really dangerous for that kid from a hard place, for that student. So making sure that we get to know them, that requires an investment. It can't be just checking the box like, yeah, I had my intake meeting with them and now I know everything about them and okay, that we're done. But paying attention to the little moments, to the interactions they have with others around us, the conversations that they have, not in crisis. So then those can guide us when there may be a crisis situation. And then learning how to communicate about a student. This is something that I am so passionate about, that Jess is so passionate about, and we spend a lot of time talking about, and our colleagues on this call probably recognize this about us. Hopefully recognize this about us, actually, that in the way that we tell the story of what is going on with a student, and the way that we frame that in our conversations, and our, we have a football learning services meeting every week, and that conversation in as a scholastic supervisor, and my conversations with our supervisors, with the coaches in our coaches meeting, the language that we're using, the way that we're framing this failed exam for one student versus this failed exam for another student. Maybe it is the same outcome, but the message, the way we frame how we got to that test score can be a big difference, whether it's the student who got a 40 and now we got a 65 and that's a great big deal, or the student who is capable of 80s and has gotten 80s on exams and now got a 45. Very different conversations that we may be having about those, and the way that we frame that is really important. So what's the result? If we make this investment, we don't just check the box, we get to know our students, what's the result? It can have a lifelong impact. As we talked about, it rewires their brain, it changes their brain chemistry. And I it's just so cool to me that we can have that kind of an impact on our students, that we can teach them how to trust, if we can teach them skills about how to communicate, how to evaluate their own safety and disarm those behaviors that were fear-based, that were grounded in these terrible things that may have happened to them. If we can rewire that, like, the long-term results are so awesome, the lifelong impact that we can have with them. It's also long-term results for us. As we talked about, we're an outcome-based world, right? That it's not just we can teach them this and then they pass this class, but if they learn these skills, then eligibility is not a concern anymore, hopefully, or they're more likely to graduate because they are enjoying learning and have found positive experiences in education that they may not have had before. It also builds confidence. We have a student who when he started out, he was working with Jess and was very attached to her, right? Everything, I would tell him something, well, I'm gonna check with Miss Jess before I do that. All these things that he needed to make sure, like, well, if Miss Jess says, then yes, I'll do it. And after a semester and a half, well, maybe it was a year, I don't know. After a while, we realized, like, okay, I think you're ready to move on to a lower level of support. You can do this, but I was really nervous how that conversation would go because of his attachment to Jess, right? But as we were able to frame that, like, this is what you've earned, this, you've worked your way, you are capable of doing this. And he was so proud to tell his roommates that he is now independent and he doesn't need Jess, and they still do, and all of these things. But it's so fun to see, like, we can enjoy the moment and the humor of it. But to me, it was really rewarding to see that he is independent and he is proud of that. And now we just had to switch his mentor, and there was no concern about that. I can just have a quick conversation like, hey, you're going to move to a different mentor. This is how it's going to be. She'll be great. And he's like, yeah, okay, I got it. I know how to do that. Those opportunities that we get by those, that's the results of this, right? It also in their personal lives can help them build healthy relationships, help them be able to use these same skills in their personal lives. And then that opportunity then breaks those generational patterns of trauma that are in their lives, that what they can do for their families and their children can have that long lasting impact, that not stay in that same cycle. So how do we incorporate this in our offices overall? We talked about, like, this is the result, this is why it's worth the time, but how do we incorporate this? This graphic I won't spend a lot of time on, but this is known as the TBRI mantra. And as we know, everyone has different learning styles and different things that stand out to them. And so we wanted to include this because it's really just a different way to frame these three principles that may be helpful for someone. I could talk about this TBRI mantra as long as we've talked about all the other stuff too, but wanted to just include it here. But overall, how do we incorporate this? Excuse me, we have to resist categorization. We have to resist the inclination to, well, you know, kids from Cali just have a hard time here, or that's, you know, remember this, that looks like just the same behavior that other student had, and we saw how that worked out. And also that how they come in, that what their story is when they arrive as freshmen, that's not their story for their whole time here, that really limits their room for growth. If we put them in a category and that's their category for the time that they're here, that's going to limit their room for growth. Then how do our policies and procedures help or hurt our students from hard places? This is something that takes a lot of time and awareness to, and, you know, may be difficult for you as one person in your office who's like on this, like, I went to this presentation and now I want to do this and we're going to change all our policies and procedures. It may not be as easy to do, but being aware of like, what are the ways that that how we do our job may be disproportionately impacting these students. The categorizing is a place I always think about with this. If we're going to categorize our at-risk students as red, yellow, green, how is that disproportionately affecting some of our students? We have to do it sometimes for efficiency's sake, but being aware that some of those procedures may be disproportionately affecting someone and being able to learn about that. We can learn about, recognize, and acknowledge signs and symptoms of this. Being able to have these conversations, acknowledge them in those meetings, like I talked about, in the way that we frame them, in the way that if someone else is talking about a student, that you can acknowledge like, oh, that's interesting that he would say that. I wonder if it's related to this, or that she would have that reaction. I wonder if maybe that's a sign of something that happened. Do we know what her relationship is like with her parents, or some of those questions, that kinds of thing. And then we practice with our students discussing their reactions or thoughts about small things so that they can learn ways to use the language of being able to share their perspective, their experiences, or even their emotions. Normalizing therapy and using campus resources. This is so important. Jess and I were just joking yesterday. It's actually closer to get to a therapist than it is to the bathroom from her lab. That's important, right? It takes normalizing using therapy and using those resources is so important. If we make it just a normal part of how we interact, of the things that we suggest, of how we communicate about ourselves and share, that can be so important. And then I can't emphasize this last point enough, that communicating the mindset and not just the best practices is so important. That if we just talk about the best practices, it's so easy to get back to, for someone to misunderstand this as, like Jess talked about in her introduction, as just babying, or, oh, you just, you're a softie about this stuff. If you only talk about the best practices, but if you can communicate the mindset of why you arrived at this decision with this student, that can make so much more impact and be able to incorporate it into your work so much more effectively, because we're communicating the mindset behind the decisions that we're making about specific students.
And I just want to throw something else in there too. Being at a Power 5, right, we have, less students, maybe we have more staff and can have more hands helping out. But sometimes you have a lot of students at lower resource schools. Students being able to be in your space to almost have this, passive relationship building. A student comes in and just does their work in your office or in your space for an hour or two, if you're able to share that space with them and it's not anything confidential. But just doing that alone, having them feel comfortable in that space, having them be able to just have a conversation with you for 5-10 minutes as they're working through things, that alone can go a really long way in building those relationships, teaching them how to feel safe in a space, and then how to advocate for themselves while they're feeling safe in that space, and building those relationships with you. And before we wrap up, we want to take a moment to thank our supervisors, Joe Fields, Dan Childs, and Michelle Stout, for the support, the encouragement, for allowing us to have these conversations, for allowing us to talk through this, and presenting today, and sharing this with you all, as well as our staff.
Before we start questions, could I just say that when y'all are done with them, I have a survey that I'm going to share my screen so that y'all can take a little picture of the QR code before I dismiss y'all. Thank you so much.
Don't everybody talk at once. Who has questions? Sure. Natalie, your question about framing Yeah, so when they go from one level of support to another, so you're talking about like moving from a learning specialist to a mentor, like that scenario I talked about, I believe. Okay, so yeah, I think it really depends on who the student is and their scenario. And I know that's kind of seems like a cop-out answer, but being able to know their strengths and the reasons that you're doing that can really help reinforce that with them. So I knew that this student that I was talking about in this scenario, that he had been with a learning specialist because he didn't have a lot of confidence in his ability, in his knowing how to do these things. But we had been working on that the whole time, right? It wasn't necessarily that he had a huge deficit learning or anything, but that his confidence around academics, around working at the college level, he's a first generation college student, those kinds of things. So we had been building that like building little steps of independence. So then that's the thing that I reinforced to him when I was selling it to him. It's also important that Jess could help with that transition, and that I, as his scholastic supervisor, could also talk to him about that. That it wasn't, oh, well, Molly's decided you don't need Jess anymore, so she's moving you, or, oh, well, Jess needs to help new freshmen, so it's time for you to be done. Those kinds of things, the way that we build that. But another student, it may be, hey, you have, you needed the help because you needed more reading strategies, and now you have those reading strategies, and we see how well you've done with that. And so we're going to move you to this level of support now, or whatever it is, making sure that it's unique to that student.
Yeah, and like Molly mentioned, our relationship and the relationship I have with other colleagues, even relationships with mentors that students work with, modeling these healthy relationships and how we work together is also very important with the students, not, good cop, bad cop, or just how we work together and how we support that student. The more they can see us on the same page, the more how we can see how we advocate for them. That makes a dramatic difference as well. And especially being a learning specialist, that is how I can best support the scholastic supervisors and even student athlete engagement and some of those relationships.
Sure. So how do we, Katie's question, how do we transition to mental health services and not take that on in your role? I think it's really just about understanding. So as a social worker, right, I think that it's very important, like my case management skills that I was taught as a social worker are really important in this area, right? We know as social workers that you're not responsible for providing all of the services, even though that may have been a part of your role. And I use that a lot in my role as an academic advisor. We call them scholastic supervisors here. And I think that's a really helpful way to describe it, right? I am just supervising their scholastic efforts. I am not actually providing very many services at all, rather than just communicating and overseeing all of that and making sure they have the right recipe of those support services. And so, yes, I may be able to notice what needs to happen or be able to see something that they're struggling with, but that doesn't mean that I am the best person to support them. And I will say that as I've grown professionally, I've gotten better at that. So don't assume that I was an expert at that from the first day, but being able to learn, get to know those people that you're referring them to, so that you trust that you've provided, you've sent them to a good support system. I think those are things that can really help you feel better about, delegating that responsibility.
Yeah, and everything that Molly said is completely accurate. And just to add on to that, working with the students, that's why I think building that trust and connection is so important, where, when they start talking about stuff that is beyond your professional scope, that it is kind of, you're taking on more than you can handle personally, professionally, ethically, is having that conversation with that student and and being able to refer them to someone that, because they trust you, there's somebody else who is also in your corner who may be able to help you out, who can provide another level of support. I'm still here, I will always be here, but they will be able to help you and give another level of support that you may need. And that helps frame that conversation.
One question, as while we have just a little bit of time, is that comes up often when we have this conversation is how do you balance, and I intended to talk about this earlier, but how do you balance the outcomes, the expectations of working in athletics with using these principles? And I think that what's important to realize that if the behavior that a student had gets them kicked out of learning services, right? That's their behavior has a consequence. That doesn't mean that we change the consequence. That doesn't mean that they don't have to experience that consequence, that you didn't show up, so you get a no-show, so you have to run, whatever it is, those consequences. That doesn't mean that we change that, but that what we can do is change how we frame why that occurred, how we have that conversation with the student, how we have that conversation in our area. That what I'm telling my supervisor is, hey, Dan, this student did this. We're going to need to kick him out of Learning Center for that. But I think that the reason why this might have happened is because of this situation. Or, hey, coach, I need this student to come back to have some extra time with us because they missed these things over the weekend. But I think this might be why that happened. And so we really want to just provide him that opportunity to still get this done. It's not so that we can support him and he can still have positive outcomes, not, hey, he was a slacker, he didn't do this, so now we need to punish him by him having all this extra time in the academic center. Those can be tricky places, and I encourage you to, as you test this out and practice, like, don't hesitate to reach out to colleagues, to run it by each other. Jess and I have these conversations all the time, like, okay, this is how I'm thinking about this would work. What do you think? How does this sound? Those kinds of things. We're happy to be there for you, and you can reach out to us, communicate with us, follow us on social media. It's weird to not do this in person and get to meet all of you, but we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you guys so much, for everything. I'm gonna share my screen so y'all can see the survey code and everything. Well, I'm sorry, 1 second. I just need to make y'all not co-host anymore.
I can stop sharing the screen.
I'm sorry?
I can stop sharing the screen.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. Okay. So here is the QR code, and you just take your phone camera and it should pop up. I think it's like a 3-question thing. It's very quick and easy. And I'll leave that up till the end of the session. And yeah, so thank you guys again so much. Everything was really insightful and definitely helpful for me going into my future careers with everything. So thank you guys so much.
You're welcome. We're happy to be here.
Yes, thank you. All right, then everyone's free to go if y'all want, as long as you get your QR code. Thank you again so much. There's more sessions to follow, but I'm sure y'all all have the links for everything. So thank you again.